Wild places don't announce danger, they reveal it in seconds. Darkness, fog, and food scent can turn parking lots, camps, and work sites into battlegrounds where raw power decides outcomes. From a 3 a.m. roadside ambush to a sleeping bag nightmare deep in Montana, expectations shift fast. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters, 6 complete stories examined clearly with lessons. The small roadside complex sat beneath frozen stars roughly 40 miles north of Fairbanks, Alaska, where winter darkness swallowed the landscape for most of each day. On January 9th, 2026, temperatures had plunged to 18 degrees below zero, and the parking lot outside the complex lay silent, except for the occasional groan of ice settling on metal rooftops. The area had seen increased bear activity over recent months due to unusually warm autumn weather that delayed hibernation patterns, leaving some animals desperately searching for calories well into the new year. Mark Carter, a 44-year-old telecommunications engineer, pulled his SUV into the nearly empty lot at approximately 3 a.m. His wife Allison, 41, sat in the passenger seat while their children, 13-year-old Evan and 9-year-old Brooke, dozed in the back after a long drive from visiting relatives. The family had stopped only briefly to use the restrooms and stretch their legs before continuing their journey home. Mark turned off the engine and stepped out into the air so cold it burned his lungs, his breath forming thick clouds that hung motionless in the darkness. The parking lot lighting flickered weakly from 2 overhead lamps, casting long shadows across patches of ice and snow. Near the rear of the building, several trash bins overflowed with food waste, their lids propped open by frozen garbage bags. The smell of discarded meat and grease had spread across the lot throughout the evening, creating an invisible beacon that drifted through the sub-zero air. Mark walked around to unlock the rear door so Allison could help the children gather their belongings. He heard nothing unusual, only the crunch of his boots on packed snow and the distant hum of a generator. As he reached for the handle, a massive shape exploded from behind the trash bins with shocking speed. The grizzly bear measured nearly 7 feet tall and weighed approximately 600 pounds. Its thick winter coat appeared almost black in the dim light, and its breath created billowing clouds as it charged directly toward the vehicle. The animal had been feeding on the trash for nearly an hour, gorging itself on discarded food, when the sound of the car doors and the warmth radiating from the recently killed engine drew its attention. The bear slammed into Mark before he could react, sending him sprawling backward onto the ice-covered pavement. His head struck the ground hard, and pain exploded through his shoulder as the bear's massive paw came down on his torso. The animal's claws, each several inches long, tore through his heavy jacket and raked across his ribs with terrible force. Mark tried to roll away, but the bear's weight pinned him partially to the ground. Allison screamed from inside the vehicle and immediately began pulling Brooke toward the front seats. The rear door hung open where Mark had unlocked it, and the bear turned its attention toward the gap, its hot breath visible in the freezing air. Evan, who had jolted awake at his mother's scream, grabbed a tire iron from the storage compartment beside him and began striking it against the metal door frame while shouting at the top of his lungs. The sharp metallic clanging momentarily confused the bear. It swung its head back toward Mark, who had managed to crawl several feet across the ice toward a nearby pickup truck. Blood soaked through his jacket, leaving dark streaks on the white snow. The bear took 2 steps toward him, then suddenly pivoted back toward the SUV, apparently drawn by the residual warmth and the movement inside. The animal reared up on its hind legs and brought both front paws down on the hood with devastating force. The metal buckled under the impact, and the windshield developed a spiderweb of cracks that spread across the glass. The entire vehicle rocked violently from side to side as the bear continued its assault, bellowing and snapping its jaws. Mark had reached the pickup truck and pulled himself beneath the chassis, his broken ribs sending waves of agony through his chest with each movement. From his position under the car, he could see Allison's silhouette as she leaned on the horn with all her weight. The sound split the frozen night, a continuous blare that echoed off the building and surrounding trees. The bear dropped back to all fours and circled the SUV, occasionally rising to slap at the windows with its paws. Deep scratches appeared in the paint, and one side mirror hung by its wiring. Evan continued banging the tire iron while Brooke pressed herself into the footwell, her hands over her ears. After what felt like an eternity but measured closer to 4 minutes, lights began appearing in the windows of the roadside complex. The horn had finally roused people inside, and someone triggered an exterior alarm, adding a pulsing siren to the chaos. The combined noise overwhelms the bear's aggression. It dropped to the pavement, swung its massive head from side to side as if trying to locate the source of all the sound, then suddenly bolted toward the tree line. The animal disappeared into the darkness with remarkable speed for its size, crashing through underbrush until the sound faded completely. Allison kept the horn going for another 30 seconds before releasing it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. Evan pushed the door open and ran to where his father lay beneath the truck. Mark had lost a significant amount of blood, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps. 3 deep lacerations crossed his chest and shoulder where the bear's claws had torn through muscle and tissue. His ribs on the left side had fractured from the initial impact, and later examination would reveal internal bruising around his lungs. Staff from the complex emerged with flashlights and blankets, and someone called emergency services, while others helped pull Mark free from his hiding spot. The family waited nearly 40 minutes for the ambulance to arrive from Fairbanks, during which time Allison and staff members applied pressure to Mark's wounds using torn shirts and towels. Evan sat with his father, keeping him talking and conscious despite the pain. Brooke stayed in the vehicle with one of the staff members, still trembling but physically unharmed. Mark spent 11 days in the hospital recovering from his injuries. The deep lacerations required extensive stitching and left permanent scars across his shoulder and chest. His broken ribs healed slowly, causing him discomfort for months afterward. Allison suffered no physical injuries, but experienced recurring nightmares about the attack. Evan and Brooke returned to school 2 weeks later, though Brooke required counseling sessions to manage anxiety about nighttime travel. Wildlife officials who investigated the scene found the bear's tracks leading away from the complex and discovered the trash bins had been unsecured for several days due to a broken locking mechanism. They determined the animal had been a mature male, likely one of several bears in the region that had delayed hibernation. The combination of readily available food waste, cold temperatures that kept the bear active and desperate for calories, and the unfortunate timing of the Carter family's arrival created conditions for the attack. Officials emphasized that such incidents, while terrifying, remained relatively uncommon even in areas with dense bear populations. The complex installed new secure bins and additional lighting within a week of the incident. The coastal terrain of Kodiak Island, Alaska, sprawled across nearly 3,400 square miles of rugged wilderness, where brown bears outnumbered human residents by a substantial margin. On October 18, 2021, the island's dense alder thickets and spruce forests had begun their autumn transformation, with temperatures dropping into the low 40s and daylight fading earlier each evening. The area where Calvin Ross, Derek Malloy, and Owen Price had chosen to hunt sat roughly 12 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by foot through challenging brush. Calvin Ross, a 51-year-old machinist from Anchorage, had hunted on Kodiak for nearly 2 decades. Derek Malloy, 44, worked as a freight coordinator and had accompanied Calvin on previous trips. Owen Price, 29 and the youngest of the group, taught high school mathematics and had earned his hunting license only 3 years earlier. The men had secured permits for deer and had tracked a small herd through coastal brush throughout the afternoon. Around 4:30 p.m., as shadows lengthened across the hillside, the hunters successfully brought down a medium-sized buck near a clearing bordered by thick alders. The animal had fallen cleanly, and the men immediately began field dressing the carcass according to standard practice. Calvin worked methodically with his knife, while Derek and Owen prepared pack frames to carry the meat back to their camp 3 miles away. Blood soaked into the moss and fallen leaves, and the sharp metallic scent spread through the still air. The island supported one of the densest populations of brown bears anywhere on Earth, with an estimated 3,500 animals inhabiting the relatively small landmass. During autumn, these bears consumed up to 90 pounds of food daily in preparation for winter, making them particularly aggressive around potential food sources. The hunters understood these risks and had discussed bear safety protocols before entering the wilderness, but the speed of what happened next gave them almost no time to react. The massive male Kodiak bear had been moving through the alder thickets roughly 50 yards downslope when the scent of fresh blood reached its nostrils. The animal weighed approximately 900 pounds and stood nearly 9 feet tall when upright. It had been feeding heavily on salmon earlier in the week but remained constantly alert for additional calories. The bear crashed through the alders without warning, moving with shocking speed for its enormous size. Calvin was bent over the deer carcass when the bear burst from the vegetation. He managed to turn his head just as the animal slammed into him with the force of a small vehicle, driving him face first into the ground. The impact knocked the knife from his hand and moved the air from his lungs. The bear's jaws closed around Calvin's shoulder and upper back, its teeth designed to crush bone, penetrating deep into tissue. Derek had been standing approximately 10 feet away, adjusting his pack frame. He fumbled for the rifle slung across his back and fired a shot into the air, hoping the sound would frighten the animal away. Owen began shouting and threw his pack toward the bear, but the animal seemed entirely focused on Calvin. The bear dragged Calvin roughly 15 feet across the clearing, shaking him violently before dropping him and backing away several steps. Derek and Owen rushed forward and grabbed Calvin under his arms, pulling him away from where he had fallen. Blood poured from multiple wounds across his back, neck, and shoulders. The bear circled the clearing, huffing and clacking its teeth together in an aggressive display. When Derek raised the rifle again, the bear charged forward, forcing both men to abandon Calvin temporarily and scramble toward a rocky outcrop at the clearing's edge. The bear stopped near Calvin's body, stood over him, sniffed, then turned its attention to the deer carcass. It grabbed the partially dressed animal in its jaws and began dragging it toward the brush line. Derek and Owen remained on the rocks, afraid to move or make noise. After roughly 8 minutes, the bear disappeared into the alders with its prize, leaving the clearing in terrible silence. The men climbed down and reached Calvin, who had lost consciousness. His injuries were catastrophic, with deep puncture wounds and massive tissue damage across his upper body. Derek attempted to stop the bleeding while Owen activated their emergency beacon. Calvin died approximately 20 minutes later, despite their efforts. Rescue personnel reached the location nearly 3 hours after the initial call, extracting Derek and Owen by helicopter as darkness fell. Both men had sustained minor cuts and bruises during their scramble to the rocks, but survived with severe psychological trauma. Wildlife officials who investigated concluded the fresh carcass scent, combined with poor visibility in the thick brush and the bear's seasonal feeding urgency, had created unavoidably dangerous conditions. The northern coast of Alaska stretched along the Arctic Ocean, where sea ice dictated polar bears' movements and behavior year-round. On February 2, 2025, a small ski resort operated on the edge of this frozen landscape, catering to adventurous tourists and locals seeking winter recreation despite the extreme conditions. The facility sat roughly 8 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by tundra that extended to the shoreline. Recent weeks had brought temperatures consistently below -20 degrees Celsius, and the sea ice that typically extended far from shore had formed late and remained thin and unstable. The resort employed a skeleton crew during early morning hours before guests emerged from their lodges. Caleb Norton, a 46-year-old maintenance supervisor originally from Minnesota, had worked at the facility for 7 years and understood the unique challenges of Arctic operations. Riley Shaw, 28, had joined the staff only 5 months earlier as a lift operator and still found the extreme environment both fascinating and intimidating. Both men arrived at the equipment shed around 5:15 a.m., nearly 90 minutes before sunrise, to prepare the chairlifts for the day's operations. The large male polar bear had been wandering the coastline for several days, struggling to find adequate hunting opportunities on the unstable ice. Adult males typically weighed between 900 and 1,500 pounds and required enormous amounts of calories to sustain their massive bodies. This particular animal measured approximately 8 feet long and showed signs of recent weight loss, indicating difficulty securing its usual prey, seals. The resort's location, normally several miles from active polar bear territory, had become more accessible as changing ice patterns pushed animals closer to human settlements. Behind the main lodge building, kitchen staff had disposed of food waste in bins near a loading area the previous evening. Among the refuse sat several pounds of fish trimmings from the resort's restaurant, along with meat scraps and other organic material. The bins lacked proper securing mechanisms, and their lids had been propped open by frozen trash bags. The scent had drifted across the tundra throughout the night, eventually reaching the bear as it moved along the shoreline. Caleb and Riley were checking hydraulic lines on the first chairlift when the bear emerged from behind the maintenance buildings. The animal moved with surprising silence across the packed snow, its white fur rendering it nearly invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. The men had their backs turned, focused on their work and discussing mechanical issues from the previous day. They remained completely unaware of the approaching predator until it was almost upon them. The bear charged without hesitation, covering the distance of roughly 40 feet in seconds. It struck Caleb from behind, knocking him forward into a snowbank with tremendous force. The impact drove Caleb completely off his feet and into the snow with enough violence to crack 3 ribs on his left side. The bear's claws raked across his heavy winter coat, tearing through the insulated material but not penetrating deeply into his skin. Caleb felt the air leave his lungs as his face pressed into the frozen snow, and intense pain radiated from his ribcage. Riley turned at the sound and saw the massive predator standing over his supervisor. He sprinted toward a nearby snowmobile parked beside the lift station and threw himself onto the seat, pulling his legs up as the bear pivoted toward him. The animal rose onto its hind legs, standing nearly 10 feet tall, and swatted at the snowmobile with enough force to rock the machine on its treads. Riley pressed himself flat against the seat, his heart pounding as the bear's massive paws came within inches of his body. Inside the main lodge, several early-rising guests had gathered near the windows to watch the preparations for the sunrise. They witnessed the attack unfolding and began shouting for help. Staff members rushed to activate emergency protocols, triggering horns and alarms throughout the facility. 2 workers grabbed flare guns kept for emergencies and ran outside, firing bright red flares into the dark sky while maintaining distance from the bear. The flares arced overhead, casting eerie red light across the snow and illuminating the scene in pulsing bursts. The combination of noise, lights, and human activity confused the bear. It dropped back to all fours and circled the area, occasionally standing upright to survey the chaos. Its head swung back and forth as it tried to identify the sources of all the commotion. Caleb had managed to crawl away from where he had fallen, pressing himself against the building's foundation, and trying to remain as still and quiet as possible despite his pain. After approximately 13 minutes of pandemonium, the bear suddenly turned and loped toward the frozen shoreline, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness with the same silence it had arrived with. Emergency responders arrived within 40 minutes and transported Caleb to the hospital, where doctors confirmed his broken ribs along with severe bruising across his back and shoulders. The injuries required pain management and restricted his ability to work for nearly 2 months. Riley suffered no physical injuries but experienced significant shock and required counseling in the following weeks to process the trauma of watching his supervisor being attacked. The resort evacuated all guests that same day and remained closed for 2 weeks while officials investigated. Wildlife experts determined that diminishing sea ice, unsecured food waste, and early morning darkness had combined to create unusually dangerous conditions that drew the desperate animal into human territory. The facility subsequently installed reinforced food storage containers and enhanced lighting systems around all operational areas to prevent future incidents. The small town of Rutland, Vermont, is nestled among the Green Mountains, where black bear populations had steadily increased throughout the early 21st century. On October 6, 2024, the region had just weathered a severe autumn storm that knocked out power across multiple counties, leaving thousands of residents without electricity for days. Trees had fallen across power lines, and utility crews worked around the clock to restore service to affected areas. The storm also disrupted normal wildlife patterns, with many animals emerging from their dens to assess the damage and search for food displaced by the high winds. Miles Donahue, a 37-year-old electrical contractor from Burlington, had driven nearly 2 hours to reach a rental cabin situated on the eastern edge of town. The property sat at the boundary between residential development and dense forest, with towering pines and maples creating a natural barrier roughly 30 yards from the backyard. The cabin's owner had called Miles 3 days after the storm, desperate to restore power before guests arrived for a scheduled reservation. Miles arrived at the property around 3:30 p.m., pulling his work van into the gravel driveway and surveying the damage. Several large branches had fallen near the cabin, and the main electrical line showed visible damage where a tree limb had torn through the connection. He unloaded a portable generator from his van, a heavy-duty model capable of powering essential appliances until permanent repairs could be completed. The generator sat behind the cabin near a woodpile, roughly 15 feet from the tree line. Miles positioned the machine on level ground and began checking fuel levels and connections. The previous occupants had apparently eaten lunch outside several days earlier, and food scraps remained scattered in the grass, half buried under fallen leaves. Nobody had cleaned the area before evacuating due to the power outage, leaving chicken bones, bread crusts, and fruit rinds to decompose naturally. Miles pulled the generator's starter cord and the engine roared to life, producing a loud mechanical rumble that echoed through the quiet afternoon. The noise masked most other sounds in the immediate area, including the subtle rustling from the forest edge. He knelt beside the machine, adjusting the choke and monitoring the power output on a handheld meter. The black bear had been foraging through the woods for most of the afternoon, searching for final calories before winter. Adult male black bears in Vermont typically weighed between 200 and 500 pounds, though some individuals grew considerably larger. This particular animal weighed approximately 380 pounds and had been drawn toward the cabin by the scent of decomposing food scraps. The bear had approached cautiously, circling the property for nearly 10 minutes and investigating various scents. The generator's vibration traveled through the ground, creating a sensation that some bears found intriguing or threatening. Combined with the food odors and the presence of a human in its perceived territory, the animal decided to investigate more aggressively. It emerged from behind the stacked firewood without warning, moving with the characteristic shuffle that belied its capability for sudden speed. Miles heard nothing over the generator's noise until the bear was almost upon him. He turned his head and saw the dark shape lunging forward, its mouth open and ears pinned back. The animal struck him with its front paws, knocking him backward into the mud with enough force to send his tools scattering across the grass. The generator tipped onto its side, still running, and began spinning in place as fuel sloshed in its tank. The bear's claws raked across Miles's legs, tearing through his work pants and leaving deep scratches along his calves and thighs. Miles kicked frantically while scrambling backward, his boots connecting with the bear's snout at least twice. An all-terrain vehicle sat parked nearby, used by the cabin owner for property maintenance, and Miles managed to reach it by crawling and stumbling across the yard. He threw himself onto the ATV's hood and pulled his legs up just as the bear circled the vehicle. The animal stood on its hind legs, easily reaching 7 feet tall, and snapped its jaws near Miles's boots. Its claws scraped against the metal hood, leaving long scratches in the paint, and it grabbed the seat cushion with its teeth, tearing the vinyl covering and pulling out chunks of foam. Miles continued shouting and kicking, his voice hoarse with fear and exertion. The bear circled the ATV repeatedly, occasionally dropping to all fours before rising again to swipe at the vehicle. Blood dripped from Miles's leg wounds onto the hood, and pain shot through his lower body with each movement. A neighbor, roughly 200 yards away, had been in his garage when he heard the generator's commotion. He emerged to investigate and saw the situation unfolding behind the cabin. The neighbor ran to his truck and began triggering the alarm, creating loud honking that carried through the trees. Another nearby resident did the same, and soon multiple vehicle alarms created a cacophony of noise. The bear dropped to the ground and swung its head toward the sounds. After several more tense seconds, it suddenly bolted toward the forest, crashing through underbrush and disappearing within moments. Miles remained on the ATV for several minutes, afraid to move until neighbors arrived to help. He was transported to the hospital, where doctors treated multiple puncture wounds and deep scratches across both legs. The injuries required stitches and antibiotics but caused no permanent damage. Miles recovered fully within 6 weeks, though he reported heightened anxiety when working in isolated locations. Wildlife officials attributed the attack to storm conditions that disrupted normal patterns, the generator noise masking the bear's approach, and food attractants creating an unusually dangerous combination of factors. The northern Italian Alps rose dramatically above the Trentino region, where centuries of human activity had carved ski resorts and mountain stations into landscapes traditionally inhabited by wildlife. On July 29, 2022, the area experienced unusually warm summer temperatures that drew both tourists and animals to higher elevations, seeking relief from the heat. A small cable car station operated on a remote mountainside, roughly 2,300 meters above sea level, servicing hikers and maintenance crews who accessed difficult terrain via the lift system. The surrounding slopes featured dense pine forests interspersed with rocky outcrops and alpine meadows. Luca Bernardi, a 41-year-old maintenance technician from Bolzano, had worked on mountain lift systems for nearly 15 years. His responsibilities included inspecting cables, pulleys, and safety mechanisms before daily operations commenced. On this particular morning, Luca arrived at the upper station around 6:15 a.m., transported by the first cable car run of the day. Thick fog had settled across the mountainside overnight, reducing visibility to less than 30 meters and creating an eerie silence broken only by the occasional call of alpine birds. Brown bears had been gradually repopulating the Italian Alps after near extinction in the previous century. Conservation efforts had successfully reintroduced animals from Slovenia, and the population had grown to approximately 100 individuals scattered across the region. These bears typically avoided human contact, but encounters increased during the summer months when both species utilized the mountain areas simultaneously. Males could weigh up to 500 pounds and stood nearly 7 feet tall when upright. The cable car station consisted of a small platform with mechanical housing beneath and a metal stairway leading down the slope, Previous visitors had left food wrappers and grease-stained napkins scattered around a trash receptacle near the platform edge, and several wrappers had blown down the hillside where they caught on vegetation. The scent of discarded sandwiches, chocolate bars, and cooking oils had accumulated over several days, creating an attractant that drifted through the fog. Luca carried his inspection equipment as he walked along the cable line, checking for wear and tension issues that could compromise safety. The fog created a disorienting environment where sounds seemed muffled and distances were difficult to judge accurately. He had completed roughly half his inspection route when he heard something large moving through the brush below the platform. The male brown bear had been foraging along the mountainside since dawn, overturning rocks and digging for insects and roots. The animal had discovered the food wrappers and followed the scent trail upward toward the station. Its thick brown fur appeared almost black in the morning fog, and condensation clung to its coat in tiny droplets. The bear climbed the slope with steady determination, emerging from below the platform where Luca stood examining a cable junction. Luca turned at the sound of claws scraping metal and found himself facing the bear at a distance of less than 5 meters. The animal's ears stood forward in an alert posture, and its nose worked constantly as it processed the various scents. For several seconds, neither moved. Then the bear suddenly charged, closing the distance with shocking speed across the narrow platform. The impact drove Luca backward against a vertical support beam, and he felt the bear's weight pressing against him as hot breath washed over his face. The animal's claws raked across his torso, tearing through his work jacket and the shirt beneath. Pain exploded across his chest and ribs as the claws penetrated skin and muscle. Luca managed to twist sideways and grab the rungs of a vertical access ladder that led to the upper cable mechanism housing. He climbed frantically, his boots slipping on the metal rungs as blood made his hands slick. The bear rose onto its hind legs, easily reaching 8 feet tall, and swatted at Luca's boots as he scrambled higher. Its claws connected with his left boot, tearing the leather and grazing his ankle. The animal roared, a deep bellow that echoed strangely in the fog, and continued to reach upward while balancing against the support beam. Inside a service hut roughly 40 meters away, 2 workers had arrived early to prepare equipment for the day's operations. They heard the commotion through the fog and emerged to investigate. One worker spotted the situation and immediately rushed back inside to activate the emergency horn system, a series of loud blasts designed to alert personnel of mechanical failures or accidents. The horns created a piercing sound that cut through the fog and reverberated off the mountainside. The bear dropped back to all fours and swung its head toward the noise, clearly agitated by the unfamiliar sound. It circled the base of the ladder twice more, occasionally rising to swipe at the air beneath Luca's position, then suddenly turned and loped down the slope. The animal disappeared into the fog within seconds, its retreat as sudden as its appearance. Luca remained clinging to the ladder for several minutes, afraid to descend until the workers reached him and confirmed the bear had departed. His chest and ribs bore deep scratches that bled heavily, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps. The workers helped him down and applied makeshift bandages while calling for emergency evacuation. A rescue helicopter arrived within 30 minutes, navigating carefully through the fog to reach the station. Luca was transported to a hospital in Trento, where doctors treated his injuries, including one fractured rib from the initial impact and multiple lacerations requiring extensive stitching. He recovered over several weeks but experienced persistent anxiety about working in isolated mountain locations. Investigators concluded that the combination of thick fog limiting visibility, early morning isolation, accumulated food waste attracting the bear, and the confined platform space had created exceptionally dangerous conditions, leaving little room for escape or deterrence, and severely reducing response time for both victims and rescuers. The wilderness of western Montana stretched across millions of acres where grizzly bears maintained their ancient patterns of movement and feeding. On August 28, 2021, a remote river trail wound through dense forest approximately 40 miles from the nearest established campground, attracting experienced backpackers seeking solitude away from crowded tourist destinations. The area sat within prime grizzly habitat, and wildlife officials had documented increasing bear activity throughout the summer as animals prepared for winter hibernation by consuming massive quantities of food daily. Evan Marshall, a 34-year-old environmental consultant from Seattle, had organized the camping trip with his girlfriend, Clara Jensen, 31, who worked as a veterinary technician. They had invited friends Noah Riley, 28, and his wife Sophie Riley, 26, both teachers from Portland. The four had met during college and maintained their friendship through annual outdoor adventures. They had secured the necessary permits and carried bear-resistant food canisters, though circumstances would prove these precautions insufficient. The group had hiked roughly 8 miles into the backcountry, following a trail that paralleled a fast-moving river fed by mountain snowmelt. They established camp in a clearing bordered by lodgepole pines and Douglas firs, setting up 2 tents approximately 15 feet apart. The location seemed ideal, with flat ground and proximity to water, though it sat along an established wildlife corridor that animals used when traveling between feeding areas. The evening passed uneventfully, as the campers prepared dinner using a portable camp stove, cooking freeze-dried meals and boiling water for coffee. They followed proper protocols by eating away from their tents and cleaning all cookware thoroughly. However, they made a critical error by storing their cooking equipment and several food items in stuff sacks placed between the tents, rather than using the bear-resistant canisters exclusively. The decision seemed minor at the time, but would prove catastrophic. Around midnight, dense fog rolled up from the river valley, blanketing the forest in thick moisture that muffled sounds and reduced visibility to nearly zero. The temperature dropped into the low 40s, and the campers retreated into their sleeping bags for warmth. By 3 a.m., all four had fallen into deep sleep, exhausted from the long hike. The massive male grizzly had been moving through the forest for several hours, following scent trails and investigating potential food sources. The animal weighed approximately 700 pounds and stood over 8 feet tall when upright. Late summer represented peak feeding time for grizzlies, as they attempted to gain several pounds daily before winter. This particular bear had learned to associate human camps with easy access to food, having successfully raided storage areas on previous occasions without negative consequences. The scent of cooking residue and stored food reached the bear from over a quarter-mile away. The animal approached the camp slowly, pausing frequently to test the air and listen for activity. The fog provided perfect cover, and the campers' deep sleep left them unaware of the danger approaching through the darkness. The bear reached the camp perimeter around 3:15 a.m. and immediately located the stuff sacks containing food and cooking gear. It tore through the fabric with its claws, scattering equipment across the clearing. The noise should have alerted the sleeping campers, but the fog seemed to absorb sound, and exhaustion kept them unconscious. After consuming the accessible food, the bear's attention turned to the tents where additional scents originated. It approached Noah and Sophie's tent first, its massive paw pressing against the nylon fabric. The tent collapsed partially under the weight, and Noah woke to find the structure crashing down around him. Before he could react or shout a warning, the bear's claws ripped through the tent wall. Sophie screamed as the bear reached inside, its jaws snapping near her sleeping bag. Noah tried to push the animal away, but the bear swatted him aside, its claws tearing through his sleeping bag and leaving deep scratches across his shoulder and arm. The couple managed to scramble out of the opposite side of the collapsed tent and ran toward the tree line. The commotion woke Evan and Clara in the adjacent tent. Evan struggled to free himself from his sleeping bag as the tent shook violently. The bear had turned its attention to their shelter, attracted by movement and additional scents. Its claws slashed through the tent fabric, and suddenly the animal's massive head pushed through the opening. Evan remained half-trapped in his sleeping bag as the bear lunged forward. The animal's jaws closed around his shoulder and upper torso, and its weight pinned him completely to the ground. He could not move his arms or legs, could not reach the bear spray attached to his pack several feet away. The pressure was enormous, crushing, and pain exploded through his body as teeth penetrated deep into tissue. Clara grabbed a flashlight and began striking it against the tent poles while screaming continuously. The metallic clanging and her voice distracted the bear momentarily. It released Evan and turned toward Clara, rising onto its hind legs inside the destroyed tent. She scrambled backward, still banging the flashlight and shouting. Noah and Sophie had reached the tree line and were screaming from their position, trying to draw the bear's attention away from the tent. The combined noise from multiple directions appeared to confuse the animal. After several more tense seconds, the bear dropped to all fours, circled the campsite once, then suddenly retreated into the fog. The entire attack lasted approximately 8 to 10 minutes. Clara immediately crawled to Evan, but his injuries were devastating. Multiple puncture wounds covered his upper body, and massive blood loss had already weakened him critically. He lost consciousness within minutes and died before any rescue could arrive. Noah activated their emergency beacon while Sophie and Clara attempted to treat Evan's wounds despite knowing the situation was hopeless. Rescue personnel reached the location nearly 5 hours later, After daylight permitted helicopter access, they evacuated the 3 survivors, all suffering from various injuries and severe shock. Investigation revealed that the unsecured food storage, dense fog, and the camp's location along a wildlife corridor had created conditions for the fatal encounter.